Module 4 is entitled Market Integration. Okay, before we discuss about integration, first let's review about economic system that we have discussed in the previous modules. So as you know, economic system is a system that talks about the interrelationships and the integratedness of the different parts. Okay, so we have different institutions, departments of a society. For example, we have the agricultural sector, we have the religious sector, the educational sector. All these different institutions are working as a whole. You know, the holistic function of these individual parts is important in understanding an economic system. Okay. Specifically, an economic system includes consumption, production, and exchange of goods and services, both internationally and domestically. So, in the case of international trade, as we have discussed before, these processes are made possible because of humans' involvement or people's involvement. In other words, the aforementioned economic players keep institutions going. Their systemic interactions make up a web of integrated individuals and institutions whose actions affect one another. That is why an economy is a system. And do not forget the fact that if it is a system, it entails smooth functioning of an economy, or what we call as economic stability. When all the integrated parts are working harmoniously, it entails a stable economy. So any alteration or any problem that arises from the different functions will result in an economic instability, such as a crisis or a depression, economic depression for that matter. Economic system generally has three sectors interacting with one another. So what are these three sectors? We have the primary sector, the secondary sector, and the tertiary sector. The primary sector basically entails the sector that produces the raw materials for production. Okay, so when we are producing a particular product, okay, what are the raw materials? These are the basic resources that are needed in order for the production to move on. Okay, so next to the primary sector is the secondary sector, which is inclined to processing, okay, of these raw materials. So once these raw materials are processed, they are going to mix up. They are going to be mixed up with other materials so that the final product will be as a result of this production process. So, for example, if you see a product in a market like a milk is an output in itself, but the processes involved in coming up with the milk include the human labor, the capital resources, and the manufacturing process. You know, when this milk from the cow is being mixed with other ingredients such as sugar and all other ingredients to come up with the final product, which is the milk. So in the aggregate terms, the society is composed of these different sectors of the economy, the interaction of which is important so that an economic system is realized. Okay, this is the same in the analysis of a market integration. Why is that so? You know, when you go to a market, you see a group of sellers, a group of consumers that interact in terms of the buying of the product from the point of view of the consumer, and of the selling from the point of view of the seller or the manufacturer. Now, when there is an interaction, an agreed interaction that takes place, you know, which is what we call as the economic equilibrium, the product is bought and consumed by the consumer. That is an indication that an interaction has taken place. Okay, now moving on. One type of a market integration that is important in this module is the study of the international financial institutions. Okay, so from the word itself, financial, so it talks about finance or money, and the institutions, which are the departments and the structures that take care of money. Okay, so we can refer to this as the banks, for example, that cater your deposits. No, when you go to the bank and you deposit your money, the bank transforms those deposits into loanable accounts that will be lent to other individuals who loan in the bank. Okay, that is an example of a financial institution. But financial institution is also other aspects of the economy. Okay, so for your learning purpose, international financial institutions are international financial organizations which multiple nations founded. They are subject to international law instead of the laws of that govern in a particular country. The international financial institutions are usually owned by national governments of founding members. Okay, so in other words, an international by the word itself, it is owned by a majority of nations that comprise the organization. It is not solely determined by a particular country, but rather there is a community of agreement, such as an allied, what you call this organization, or in the case of, let's say, Association of Development Bank. Okay, is an example of an international financial institution that correlates to banks within the Asian region. Okay, and there are so many international financial institutions that we will be discussing in this module. Okay, sometimes other international institutions or organizations are stakeholders as well, even though there are international financial institutions that two or three nations created. The best known ones were developed by numerous national partners. The most famous international financial institutions arose following the Second World War in order to help rebuild Europe as well as America, and these are multinational corporations that sought in restoring balance in the world economy. Okay, so what happened during World War II? Okay, the United States had to rebuild, okay, its domestic and international economy, and with that they created a financial organization, and the most important organization that was created was conducted in New Hampshire. Okay, in 1944, this was called the Bretton Woods system. Okay, the Bretton Woods system was an agreement signed by the members of allied nations such as USA, United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and other superpowers as an economic cooperation, so that the destabilizing effects of World War II would be diminished. Okay, on the Great Depression. Let's talk about the Great Depression for a little bit. Sometime in the 1930s, the economy of the United States went into negative output, or what we call as contraction. Now, a negative contraction that extends to a long period of time results in a recession. Okay, at first. Usually, it's about 3 months of negative output. Now, when recession extends to longer periods, it becomes a depression. So depression has a macroeconomic impact because it affects the overall economic performance. The banking system turns into collapse. Okay, business is bad. Okay, and then there's a lot of unemployment in an economy. There is very high inflation, but there are no jobs available in order to buy those expensive goods. And in terms of the monetary policy, the value of the money, okay, during the Great Depression was very, very low because of the high inflation, or what we call a superinflation, that took place within that time. All right, so that's a brief description of a Great Depression sometime in the early part of 1930s. Now, during World War II, as a result of the large losses, okay, and physical destruction, some economists, including the United States, even if the United States was at the forefront of the war, it also suffered damages, physical damages to the structures and to the economy as a whole. So what the U.S. did was it formulated an alliance with other allied nations. These allied nations were the economic support, economic, military, and political support of the United States that defended democracy for global alliance. So yun yun, yung mga countries ng Japan and Canada, Australia, and all the other major superpowers in the West created this Bretton Woods system in order to rebuild a shattered economy as a result of World War II. So what's the most important element of this Bretton Woods is that the dollar, being the currency of the United States, was the most important money in the entire globe. Okay, and it was actually pegged towards the amount of gold that was available. So if you had like 35 ounces of gold, that would equivalent to like a dollar of some sort. So in other words, dollar was tantamount to, I mean, gold was tantamount to having a dollar for that matter, and this was American dollar. So all other what you call this monetary exchanges were always in relation to the dollars. That's why the birth of the exchange rate system was signified during this period. At the early part of the Bretton Woods system, the governments agreed on a fixed exchange rate. So what does it mean, a fixed exchange rate? A fixed exchange rate is an exchange rate that is determined by a fiat or by a government rather than by the market forces. No? So what was the difference? In a market, in a free or a floating flexible exchange rate system, or in the dollar or any particular currency for that matter, would actually be influenced by the market forces, depending on the supply and demand of the currencies, so that the value will fluctuate. Now, in a fixed exchange rate, the exchange rate is determined by the central bank, or in the United States, it's called the federal state, okay, which supplies the money and also dictates the economy in terms of the exchange rate that is determined for the United States and for its transactions with the rest of the world. So that defined the Bretton Woods system. Now, in later on, the Bretton Woods system was modified into, at least in this aspect, where the floating exchange rate or the flexible exchange rate took place, because other economies throughout the world were also having problems in terms of their economic advantage with the United States. Now, if there's going to be a fixed exchange rate, the other players will have to adjust all the time, so that some of them might be in a very disadvantaged position. Okay. Another example of a financial institution that was created out of the Bretton Woods is called the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. Apart from the role of the IMF to monitor exchange rates, you will begin to realize that the institution was tasked to help war-ravaged economies to rebuild from devastation. Next, it was built to lend reserve currencies to nations with trade deficits and to encourage and further international trade. Okay, so the IMF was basically an organization that helped in restoring economies that were ravaged by the war. And how did they help these economies? By extending loans at very, very low interest rates, so that they would be able to rise from the rubbles of war. Okay, today the IMF has 189 member nations working to foster global monetary cooperations, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, and to promote high employment and sustainable economic growth and reduce poverty over the world. The IMF helps economies by extending loans, as I said earlier, in order to revive financial instability. In the case of the Philippines, being a recipient of IMF loans, okay, especially in 80s and in the 90s and even up to this date, there were some problems that went along with this loan what they call it, extension, because we would be subject to some changes in the interest rates. Sometimes the interest rates would actually be higher, as it is related to the level of inflation. When there is high inflation, when there's inflation rather, the tendency for the prices of the goods will be to increase, of course, and then that would result to higher interest rates in terms of the loans, so that the value of the loaned amount will be equated with the inflation that happens during that period. So, in the case of the Philippines, financing loans through IMF was also contributing to the economic stagnation because of this debt, burden that the country had to suffer, and it was very, very prominent during the time of Marcos, President Marcos, in sometime in the 1980s. Okay, the IMF helps economies by extending loans, as I said earlier. The overarching idea of IMF's role is the increased interdependence of nations following devastation in World War II, which linked nations in their quest for economic progress. So, in other words, the loan privileges actually help these countries achieve an interdependent relationship with these organizations. It was kind of like a dependency concept that the Philippines and all the other third world countries extended to the IMF, in order to obtain loans. Okay. Another institution that was created out of the Bretton Woods, aside from the IMF, was the World Bank. The World Bank is an international financial institution that provides loans, okay, similar to IMF, and grants the governments of poorer countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects. This is according to worldbank.org. It was organized in mid-1940s to extend temporary loans to war-torn nations with poor economic activity, with poor income, that could not obtain loans by themselves to pursue economic recovery. Although it started with such mission, today World Bank is more focused on addressing poverty, such as construction of roads, health facilities, among others, and the typical banking system or what that anyone can see. So, in other words, the World Bank, when it started first as an institution that provided loans to these war-torn economies, eventually shifted their focus to more economic activities, such as amelioration from poverty by creating these bridges, roads, and what you call agricultural product, in order to increase agricultural productivity, providing farm to market roads, etc., etc. Now, despite these achievements of the World Bank, being a very, very large institution, it was also susceptible to corruption. There have been issues with the World Bank facing scandals, with so much money pouring into the economy, into the organization. There was a question about the functionality of those financial expenditures. In some cases, there were forced savings, wherein World Bank would be allotting smaller expenditures in order to save. But the question was how this saving was allocated. No, was it used for other projects, or was it used to pay, salaries or bonuses and some sort? This is a very popular. Very infectious. It's a very infectious disease that also affects the Philippine economy when organizations, institutions are encountering forced savings in order to save money. But the question there is, how is money being used when it is saved? Is it being appropriated by the staff, or does it go back to the treasury, or is it used for further expenditures, etc., etc.? That remains a question. Okay, moving on, we have the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, or what we call as GATT. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was a legal agreement that reduced international trade barriers among member nations. The law, which took effect on January 1, 1948, reduced quotas, tariffs, and subsidies meant to revitalize World War II stricken economies through liberalizing global trade. This ultimately eased international trade. So, in other words, the general agreement was basically to create a free movement of the goods between the nations that were affected, so that they were no longer having quotas and tariffs that were trade barriers. So these barriers were removed so that the free movement would allow for goods and services to transfer from one place to another, creating more jobs and, of course, creating more income. Historically, GATT was implemented as a response against costly restrictions of pre-war protectionist policies. Okay, so the protectionist policies like tariffs, as we discussed in the previous module, talked about government restrictions in order to raise the prices, hence protecting the local industry. But there were questions. Okay, they were actually costly on that, for that matter. Also, the government was meant to arbitrate commercial disputes among nations, and the framework enabled a number of multilateral negotiations for the reduction of tariff barriers. So just these multilateral trade agreements allowed for free movement of goods and services within the countries. The guiding principle of the organization that practiced non-discrimination among member nations was called most favored nation principle. For example, if a tariff was implemented in one country, the same action was given to other nations without prejudice. Okay, so there was no discrimination. Everybody was treated equally, rather than discriminately. Okay. Next institution was the World Trade Organization, which is based on agreements signed by the majority of the world's trading nations. The main function of the organization is to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers protect and manage their businesses. As of 2019, the World Trade Organization has 164 member nations, with Liberia and Afghanistan as the most recent members, having joined in 2016. WTO is essentially an alternative dispute or median entity that upholds the international rules of trade among nations. The organization provides a platform that allows member nations to negotiate and resolve trade issues with other members. The WTO's main focus is to provide open lines of communication concerning trade between its members. So, in other words, World Trade Organization is basically an organization that serves as a body for negotiations in terms of trade issues, concerning exports and trades, so that solutions will be brought to the table and discussed openly, and without prejudice, so that other members of the organization will be allowed to air their points of views, just like any kind of organization there is today. No negotiation, mediation, or resolution would be possible without the foundational WTO agreement. So, in other words, there has to be a consensus. There has to be a collective agreement among the WTO, members for a certain decision to be carried out. Okay, this agreement set the legal ground rules for international commerce that the WTO oversees. Okay, it is the guiding principle then. All right. Moving on, there are other financial organizations here. We have the OECD, or Organization for Economic and Development, which is an intergovernmental economic organization established in 1961 to promote economic growth and world trade, especially to its 37 member countries. The members are united by a common principle of democracy and market economy. Members of this organization are high-income countries with high human development index. In other words, they are developed countries. Although the member countries come from rich regions, the organization's mission is to promote policies that will improve the economic well-being of people around the world. Also, poverty alleviation and environmental protection are among the urgent issues of this think tank group of countries that meet in order to formulate solutions to global issues. In other words, the OECD is an organization of rich nations with its goal to ameliorate the abject conditions of poverty among other nations that don't have capital or don't have the resources that will address their financial difficulties. Today, OECD takes pride in its collaborations with policymakers in coming up with sound policies that extend beyond economic growth. Issues such as sustainable development, health, skill works, work-life balance, and life satisfaction are part of a growing concern among member groups. The use of new technology helps hasten production process while addressing the well-being of the general people. All right, and next we have the Organization of Petroleum Countries, or OPEC. It was an intergovernmental organization established at the Baghdad Conference in 1960 by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Its objective was to coordinate and unify petroleum policies among member countries in order to secure fair and stable prices for petroleum producers in an efficient, economic, and regular supply of petroleum to consuming nations, and a fair return on the capital to investing in the industry. Okay, but there was a controversy in OPEC that put the nation to a test. I mean, put the organization to a test because it was conceived as a cartel. You know, a cartel is a group of let's say monopolists that control the prices. And in effect, the cartel results into high prices of goods that will benefit the producers, but the prices will actually harm the consumers. So this happened in the case of OPEC. When oil, okay, they tried to control the supply of oil as as a cartel, and henceforth they tried to increase the prices of oil, which created a supply shock. Okay, what is a supply shock? A supply shock is a situation where there is a very limited supply of oil. That's why it's called a shock. No? And the limited supply of oil results in a high price of that oil. Okay? And what is the effect on the economy? It contracts the economy, or it brings the economy to a negative state wherein there's going to be less output, hence lesser production and lesser economic output for that matter. So OPEC was criticized for that because it had a worldwide impact. Remember, it is oil. Oil is consumed by many nations around the world. In fact, all nations are using oil, okay, because it is a very important material for production and all other economic processes. Okay, next we have the European Union. The European Union, okay, is an international organization comprising 27 European countries and governing common economic, social, and security policies. In the beginning, it was confined to Western European countries, but later included Eastern European in its scope. Okay, the Union's objectives, based on the Lisbon Treaty, include the promotion of peace and well-being of the Union citizens, an area of freedom, security, and justice without international frontiers, sustainable development based on balanced economic growth and social justice, a social market economy, highly competitive and aiming at full employment and social progress, and a free single market. So, European Union is equivalent to the ASEAN, okay, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is a form of an economic integration as well. Now, ASEAN is encouraging free movement of people and goods and services as well among the members, in the same way as the European Union has the same idea of free movement, okay, within the boundaries. So there are no visas. There is a single currency in EU, which is called the euro. The euro is a great achievement of the European Union. But in the case of the ASEAN, we don't have an ASEAN currency or a single currency, and it has been suggested before to create a single currency in order to promote this oneness and single economy.